Welcome to what should be an incredible day. Not only is it Earth Day, but we are here for Earth Optimism. If anyone on social media, hashtag Earth Optimism, please, all throughout the day. My name is Ben Garrod. I'm an evolutionary biologist, a BBC broadcaster, teaching fellow over at Anglia Ruskin, and I specialise in primatology. I'm also, as Jane will often tell people left, right and centre, I was her waiter many years ago, and that's how I started my job. So I'm the luckiest waiter in Britain. I've got 5 minutes to introduce today, and it should be, as I said, an incredible day ahead of us. And we're looking at lots of different themes. And the theme, or the idea of Earth optimism, comes at a pivotal moment. I want to ask, what is a conservationist? And why is conservation so important right now? We tend to think of conservationists as these muddy, mosquito-ridden, dirty people that are somewhere in the swamps of Patagonia or Madagascar or whatever, dedicating their lives and losing limbs in the process. And that doesn't need to be the case. A conservationist is anyone who wants to make the world that little bit better. It can be you making a bug hotel. It can be using recyclable cups rather than the throwaway cups. It's anyone who makes that positive change to make the world around you that little bit better. And if we take nothing else away from today, it's that each and every one of us here not only is a conservationist, but we all have that responsibility and that potential to make that world that little bit better around us. And why is it so important right now? We are on a pivotal point in history. It's so easy to think that we're past the point of no return through politics, and we all know there's some dodgy politics going on right now, whichever side of the water you're from. Just going to leave that one there. Whether it's politics, whether it's climate change, we're so used to hearing how bad things are. As a primatologist, there was a paper out recently saying that 60% of our primates are endangered or critically endangered and will be gone within the next 25, 30 years. We've got people who specialise in amphibians here, and 30% have gone extinct or nearly extinct through chytrid alone. We're so used to being barraged with negative conservation stories, but that's not why this is so important right now. It's so important at this moment because we can make the biggest change now. It's galvanizing us. It's giving this reason of hope, this power, this sense of stewardship that we really can make a difference. I was talking with Jane last night, and she said, as things become more difficult, it just makes us try that little bit harder. It's an exciting time. We can do things we could never do before. And the idea that each and every one of us is a conservationist right now will enable us all to make that little bit of a difference. It's an exciting point. So, we've got a whole range of wonderful speakers today. But first, our initial speaker, our plenary talk of today doesn't need an introduction. But Dr. Jane Goodall started her research many years ago now in Gombe in Tanzania and changed the way we thought, not only about primates, but about the animal world as a whole. Moving on from there, Jane later saw that it wasn't enough just to do the research in its own capacity. She decided to go out and engage and bring the people in because they can make the biggest difference themselves. And what started with just a few students across Tanzania has turned into a global network of driving change. And I know there are lots of roots and shoots people here today. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jane Goodall.
Well, what a great welcome. And you know, it's early in the morning, and I'm sure some people were partying last night. So, you know, let's have a rousing, and anybody who can join in this is how chimps greet the day. And you see, that's my signature trademark. I like to begin that way. Well, you know, it did really, my career as such began when I was watching a hen and wondering where the egg came out when I was 4 years old. And I apparently waited 4 hours in the hen house, and I actually saw where the egg emerged. So that was my first experience in observing animals. And anyhow, this love of animals led me eventually to save up and go to Africa. Hadn't been to college because we didn't have enough money. So I got to Africa, and there I was fortunate enough to meet the late Louis Leakey, and this is now history. He offered me the opportunity to go and study chimpanzees. And gradually, over the years, it became obvious that there is no sharp line dividing us from the rest of the animal kingdom. It's a very blurry line. And yet, when I came to Cambridge, because Louis Leakey said, Jane, you have to get a degree. There's no time for a BA. I've got you a place in Cambridge University to do a PhD in ethology, and I didn't even know what ethology was. And when I arrived at Cambridge, it was thought at that time, 1962, that the difference between us and other animals was one of kind. And I was talking about the personalities of the chimpanzees I'd come to know. I was talking about the fact that they had emotions like happiness, sadness, fear, that they had a good intellect and could solve problems, and that they had personalities. And I was told by many of the professors here that this was wrong, my science was wrong, animals should be numbered, and these other attributes were unique to us. Well, fortunately, I'd learned as a child from my dog that that wasn't true. And I had an amazing supervisor, and it feels very strange to come to Cambridge with no Robert Hind here. But he managed to steer this ignorant, naive young woman through the hurdles so that I got my PhD, whilst managing to hang on to my conviction that the scientists who told me that animals were so different were wrong. And back in Gombe, I built up a research station. It was the most amazing time in my life, because I had time to be out in the rainforest. I could feel the interconnectedness between all the different species in the rainforest and how each one had its role to play and each one mattered. And time with the chimps, built up a research station, fantastic students came, I could talk to them in the evenings. And why did I leave? I left because in 1986, at a conference in the US, we brought together all the people who, at that time, were studying chimps in about, I think it was 6 or 7 different parts of Africa. And it was a shock. I think it was a shock to all of us to find that everywhere where people were out in the field, chimpanzee numbers were dropping, forests were disappearing. There was the beginning of the bushmeat trade, the commercial hunting of wild animals for food, the live animal trafficking, mothers shot to sell their infants. And there was the logging companies coming in and human populations growing, and it was grim. And I went to that conference. By then I was a scientist with a wonderful life, and without making any conscious decision, I left as an activist. I knew I had to try to do something. I had no idea what I could do. I went to Africa, and I managed to get enough money to go to 6 range countries. And yes, I did learn more about the chimpanzees, but I also began to learn about the plight of so many of the people living in and around the forest areas. And this came to a head when I flew over the little Gombe National Park. It's only about 30 square miles. Originally, it was part of the equatorial forest belt. And when I flew over in 1991, I was shocked to look down and see a little oasis of forest surrounded by completely bare hills. And if I had photographs, I'd show you, but you can look them up on the internet. They were bare. There were more people living there than the land could support, struggling to survive, cutting down the forest because they had to try and feed their families. And so it was at that time that I realized unless we help the people to have better lives, there's no chance of saving the chimpanzees. And we began a project called Take Care, or Takari, that's the Jane Goodall Institute. And starting with what the people in the villages thought we might do to help them, that's where we began. We got small grants, and the program became successful. I have no time to go into the details. Again, you can look it up on the internet. But it was so successful that the villagers have now become our partners. And they are setting aside land for restoration. The trees in that part of the world anyway are very resilient from seeds left in the ground. The trees have now sprung up. There are no more bare hills around Gombe. We began with 12 villages. We're now in 52. Around Gombe, we're restoring the forest. Down in the south, we're protecting the forest and its chimpanzees. And this is so successful that this program is now starting in 6 other African countries. So all of this, of course, takes a lot of money. And so I began traveling around because people wanted me to come and talk, and I thought, well, I can raise awareness too about what's going on in Africa and the problems we face there, at the same time as trying to raise some funds. And of course, then I began learning more and more about what I already knew something about, and that is what we are doing to this planet, what we're doing to Mother Earth. And here you come to the big difference between us and chimpanzees, the explosive development of our intellect. So how bizarre that the most intellectual creature to ever walk on planet Earth is destroying its only home. And I don't need to explain to you who are here today what it is that we're doing. But we are recklessly using the finite natural resources. And soon we shall get to a point of no return. Soon the doomsday scientists will be proved right. But as Ben says, we have a window of time. And in that window of time, it's up to each and every one of us to try and make change. And some people are in a much more better position to make that change than others. But we can all do our part. And the lucky thing for me is, I'm traveling 300 days a year all around the world. And it's pretty exhausting. And it's pretty grim. Make no mistake, I see areas that have been devastated. And when you see piles of elephant tusks in some, government confiscation area, and when you see forests razed to the ground, it's grim. But at the same time, everywhere I go, I'm meeting amazing people who are fighting to save a species, whether it's animal or plant, who are fighting to restore an environment, who are fighting to clean a river. And you'll hear about some of those things today. So there are these amazing projects and these incredible people everywhere I go. There is much more awareness now than there was 10 years ago. And it's a bit sad that not enough people are changing their behavior. And that's partly because people feel, what can I do? I'm one person, there's so many problems in the world. And they feel helpless and hopeless. And I realized as I was traveling around that so many young people, high school students, university students, young people out in their first jobs, they felt the same. And I talked to them, and they said, well, we feel this way because you've compromised our future, and there's nothing we can do about it. We have compromised the future of young people. You hear this saying, we haven't inherited this planet from our parents, we borrowed it from our children. We haven't borrowed from our children, we've stolen. And we're still stealing their future. And we now have to get together around the world and help our young people to restore some of the harm that we've inflicted. So it was because of this that I began our Roots and Shoots program back in 1991 in Tanzania with 12 high school students who came to me concerned about all kinds of different problems in Dar es Salaam. They were worried about the street children sniffing glue who had no homes. They were worried about the cruel treatment of domestic dogs, stray dogs. They were worried about the destruction of the coral reefs. They were worried about why isn't the government prosecuting the poachers who are killing elephants and giraffes in our national parks. And so I told them to get together friends who felt the same. And we had a meeting, and from that meeting, this program, Roots and Shoots, was born. And right from the beginning, the main message was the message that Ben delivered so eloquently earlier: every single one of us can make a difference every single day. And it may seem that the choices we make, what we buy, what we eat, what we wear, make no difference in the sum of things. And if it was just one person making ethical choices, it wouldn't make any difference. But the cumulative effect of hundreds, then thousands, then millions, and eventually billions of people all making ethical choices will start to move us towards the kind of world that we can pass down to our children with a little bit of pride. Right now, we can't. So from the start, because I have always understood the interconnectedness of all living things and all problems too, it was decided that the Roots and Shoots groups would tackle 3 different projects, which they would choose themselves. It was not going to be a top-down, this is what you do. No, this is going to be a group of young people. What are you passionate about? Okay, some of them are passionate about animals. Some of them are passionate about the environment and the pollution and the litter. Some of them are passionate about the fate of the people around them. And so, from the start, every group chooses 3 projects: animals, people, environment. It doesn't mean every member of the group has to do all of it, but they do have to share the results of their projects. And I can tell you the difference this is making. From those 12 high school students, when we began in 1991, Roots and Shoots is now in 98 countries and growing. And we have members from kindergarten, even a few preschoolers, very strong in university, everything in between. And it's even beginning to slowly move outwards into older people, so that we have some very successful programs for old people, retired people. We have programs that are working really well in prisons and among the staff of some big corporations. But basically it's youth-driven. And it's everywhere I go now, there are young people with shining eyes wanting to tell Dr. Jane what they've been doing to make this a better world. They are inspired and they understand the problems, and because we listen to their voices, they are empowered. And so I say Roots and Shoots is making a difference. Let me give you one example. I've been going back and forth to China since 1993. And when I first went, nobody was talking about the environment. In fact, they weren't allowed to by the government. And there was not much concern for animals, a lot of cruelty around. But gradually, as Roots and Shoots has spread, there's about 2,000 groups in China now. And I've seen over the years how attitudes have changed. And so just on this last trip before Christmas, there were so many people saying, well, of course I care about the environment. I was in Roots and Shoots in primary school. Of course I care about animals. I was watching your National Geographic documentaries about you and the chimps when I was in primary school. So Roots and Shoots has had some impact on changing attitudes in a country like China. You all know they've banned the sale of ivory by the end of this year. They've closed down the factories where the ivory ornaments were carved. They're building a huge, what they call a bird airport. It's merely a huge area on the main migration route of birds through China, where they've got wetlands and it's going to have a big education center. So it really has made a difference. But I think, you know, one of the most important things is to realize what we are doing that's so important. And we're doing it because of what I call the indomitable human spirit, the people who tackle the impossible and won't give up. And it's led to change in so many different areas. It's led, as I've said, to people fighting on the ground to save species and to restore habitats. It's led to the development of some innovative technology where we actually, if governments would subsidize clean, sustainable energy instead of still clinging to their old buddies in the fossil fuel industry, we could be free of fossil fuels and all the resulting pollution. But, you know, we have a long way to go, and another responsibility of ours is, if we really care, then we mustn't buy products from companies and industries that are polluting. We need to write to our governments. We need to make our voices heard. And through social media now, we can do this in a way that was never possible before. We can gather hundreds of thousands of people around the world to to coordinate and express what they're feeling about a single issue. So today is Earth Day. It's a day when around the world people are marching for science. And of course, science has been receiving a battering in the United States. And so our Roots and Shoots groups, indeed, all around the world are taking part in these marches for science. And eventually, if enough of us get together and make our voices heard, it will lead to governments and business changing. But we must play our parts. So I think I want to end up, there's an awful lot more to say, but I hope that some of you visit the Solutions Fair. We have a Roots and Shoots booth there. I'm sure that during today you're going to be inspired, because I know that some of the people giving talks are very inspirational and their projects are very inspirational. I wish I had a lot more time. I'd love to talk about some of these projects. And it was these inspirational people and amazing programs that I encountered that led me to write the last two books. One is Hope for Animals and Their World, where every chapter is about a species that wouldn't be with us if it wasn't for these people who said, no, not on our watch. And the second one, Seeds of Hope, which is about the plant kingdom. And what an amazing journey for me that was. And how incredible are these plants and trees. The fact that trees can communicate with each other by pheromones and by microfungi in the roots. I mean, we've got so much to learn. And I always say when I'm in a university, if anybody wants to study animal behavior or plants today, it is the most exciting time in my whole 83 years, because you can now study things about animals which I couldn't have studied because I was told they didn't exist. Animals didn't have emotions. They didn't have ability to reason, and they didn't have personalities. Now you can study those things, and we're finding out so much. It's a very exciting time. And I want to end with I think the video is 3 minutes, just to show it's not only humans who have this indomitable spirit, it's other species too. And this is a little video about one of the chimpanzee orphans that we've taken into our two big sanctuaries in Africa, whose mothers were mostly killed for the bushmeat trade. And it's about a chimpanzee who twice came close to death, once when her mother was shot, another time when she had a terrible disease, and was saved by the first blood-to-blood chimpanzee blood-to-blood transfusion in Africa by our wonderful veterinarian, Rebecca. So I want to end with this little 4-minute video, which kind of takes me back to my roots. Some of you will have seen it, but you won't mind seeing it again. This is a really exciting moment for me. The Jane Goodall Institute's Chimpunga Chimpanzee Rehabilitation Center in the Republic of Congo has for years been caring for infants whose mothers were killed, mostly for the illegal bushmeat trade. Many of them are now fully grown. Recently, we acquired 3 large forested islands on the beautiful Kwilu River, where we can release many of the chimpanzees from our overcrowded center. In here is Wunda, and she nearly died, but thanks to Rebecca, she came back from the dead. And here she is about to come out into this paradise. She's the 15th chimpanzee to get her freedom here. And we hope ultimately to have about 60 on the island. Today is the first time I've met Wunda. I talked to her on the boat, trying to reassure her. She must have wondered what was happening. None of us could predict exactly what she would do once the cage door opened. It was a very, very touching moment. One of the most amazing things that's ever happened to me. The warmth of her embrace is something I shall never forget. For Wunda and all the other chimpanzees we're working to bring here, Chinzula Island will provide a wonderful forest home where they will be cared for and safe. Let me just tell you, Wunda is an amazing female in many ways. All of our females are on birth control because, you know, we've already got 67 chimpanzees and it's very expensive. One of the females, just one, the implant went wrong, and that was Wunda. Wunda is now the alpha female of a group of 30, including adult males, although that will change. She had her baby successfully, and we've called that baby Hope. So there is hope for the future. And I can't stop without thanking all the staff and volunteers of the Jane Goodall Institute, you know, including Ben and others who are here today. If there was time, I'd tell you all their names, but I'd be in big trouble from Ben. And he's not my waiter anymore. So, you know, anyway, so thank you all for listening. And, you know, don't forget, every single day, every single one of us makes some kind of difference, and we have a choice. What kind of difference are we going to make? Thank you.
Well, that started the day off nicely, didn't it? If you're not inspired by that, you need to leave now. All right? There are spare Kleenex at the front as well for those who've got a little bit. Our next speaker can't be with us today. She's in Washington and probably still asleep. So we're going to have a pre-recorded video link with her, and we've got Nancy Knowlton, one of the founders of Earth Optimism and one of the real drivers for everything that we're standing for and trying to achieve. So we've got a little video from her just now.
Good morning, Earth Optimism Cambridge. My name is Nancy Knowlton, and I'm greeting you from Earth Optimism, Washington, D.C. We're about halfway through the first day of what's already an incredibly exciting, inspiring, empowering meeting, and I'm sure that yours, which is just starting now, will be exactly the same. We're so glad to have you as part of the Earth Optimism family, to stop talking just about doom and gloom when it comes to conservation and talk about the successes, because there's so many out there and we just need to scale them up and make more of them. We're really looking forward not only to hearing about the outcome of your meeting, but also working with you into the future, because this is not a single standalone event. This is the beginning of changing the conservation conversation. Thank you again for being part of this. I look forward to hearing about everything that happened in Cambridge. So have a great meeting, and we'll see you again soon.
Brilliant. Next up, we've got, in a title talk called More Fun, Less Stuff, Professor Tim Jackson, who is a Professor of Sustainable Development at the University of Surrey and Director of the newly awarded Centre for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity. Should be an interesting talk. Tim.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you very much for the invitation here. Thank you to Jane for a wonderful, inspirational talk. She and Ben both talked about the possibility that not everyone is necessarily that kind of hero conservationist, that we all have the possibility to be everyday conservationists, if you like, and I'm definitely that kind of conservationist. I'm definitely not out there all the time with animals in the wonderful way that you just heard about and saw with Jane. And I feel, actually, at this point in my life, a kind of envy, an extraordinary envy of the opportunities to be engaged in that way with and in the wild. And it's very clear, in a sense, to me, even from that envy, that we can't all be doing that. Some of us have to be everyday conservationists. Some of us even have to be economists. And that's a burden, let me tell you. But I want to start with a little story about that relationship between us and the wild. And I want to tell it through the eyes of my children, who, when they were very young, I used to take away on holiday quite a lot to the Lake District. And there, very close to Ulverston, somewhat unbelievably, lives a little corner of a slightly distorted view of conservation called the South Lakelands Animal Park. I don't know if anyone's been there, but it's a kind of a zoo. And kids actually do have this fascination with animals. They love to see animals and be in close proximity to animals and interact with them. So I thought this would be a fantastic day out for us to go to the South Lakelands Animal Park and see some of the animals there. So we went there, and yeah, no, it was an interesting experience. The first thing was the snake house, and we arrived at feeding time. So I had 3 small children with me, all looking at feeding time in the snake house, where live mice were being dropped into the pens, and children were asking with some concern, of course, what was going to happen to these live mice. So I ushered us quickly onwards, because I felt as though they weren't quite old enough for some of the savager bits of wildlife. And so I took us next to, we were at the monkey pen, and the bonobo monkeys were doing what bonobo monkeys do. And for those of you who don't know, the bonobo monkeys, essentially, their interpretation of social intercourse is, well, intercourse. And so I had, again, 3 young children, and I was tasked with explaining to them what exactly the bonobo monkeys were doing. And again, I hurried us on. It wasn't all so difficult as a parent, I have to say. There were wonderful moments, and there were some of the animals in particular that my children really took to, and to this day still aspire after. And one of these was the giraffes. And a few months after this trip, I was doing some everyday conservation. I was putting up some insulation in my house, and I was doing this very carefully. These little strips of plastic insulation around the doors and around the windows. And my then 5-year-old daughter came up to me and said, "What are you doing, Daddy?" And I said, "Well, I'm putting this insulation around the windows." "What's that going to do?" "It's going to keep out the drafts." And she looked at me for some time, very carefully and thoughtfully, and then she said, "Daddy, is this really going to keep out the giraffes?" And you can feel the anxiety of the 5-year-old about these giraffes, these long-legged creatures who somehow have got into the garden and are marauding through the south of England. And will they still be there on Monday when I have to go to school? How are we going to navigate? And at first I took this, keeping out the giraffes as a sort of childhood misunderstanding. But the more I thought about it, I realized it was a kind of a metaphor, that there is a sense in which our everyday lives and even our best intentions at everyday conservation have to take place in the context of this idea that we are ordinary people living difficult lives. We get up in the morning, we get our kids out of bed, we make sure they have some breakfast, we get them on the bus to school, we get ourselves into some office somewhere where we work all day to provide the provisions that allow us then after work to go to the supermarket, pick up a few groceries, get back home, make sure the kids are okay, ask them a little bit about their day, put something on the table, and then perhaps for a few brief hours collapse in front of the television and watch David Attenborough or Jane Goodall and inspire ourselves with this contact, with dreams, with the wonder of the world, with the things that we aspire to, with everything that makes us human. And so I began to think about this, actually, that this is the context in which everyday conservation actually takes place, the context of having busy, difficult lives when we're trying to do the best, not just for ourselves, but actually for our families, and only occasionally have that huge, wonderful space to dream. And these things are a way, really, of introducing what Andrew asked me to talk about here, which is, and again, if I can just tell the story through the end of that day when we were in the South Lakelands Animal Park, because as everyone knows who's visited a zoo, you kind of have this idea that you're going into a wonderful wide open space and you're going to be roam freely and you're going to have this contact with the wild world. But the reality is you're kind of walking down a little narrow pathway about this big with 150 other parents and 350 other grumpy children, all clawing at the way, trying to get a little bit closer to the animals, not quite being able to see what you came to see, having spent a lot of money to get there, and then being herded mercilessly into the gift shop. And the gift shop is really ultimately the end point, almost the object of the South Lakelands Animal Park, because there, surrounding you, between you and the exit, is a whole horde of fluffy toy animals. And the kids who never had the chance to interact with the animals that they wanted to see, of course, are absolutely desperate to have a fluffy toy to remember the day by. And there's something wonderful about that. There is something nice about that. And as a parent, of course, having spent this slightly grumpy hour and a half not quite seeing animals and knowing that you have these rather fractious kids with you, you are very much persuaded to buy, to consume, to spend the money that we're being encouraged to spend. And that's the sense in which I left that day, thinking, well, I didn't have a lot of fun. My kid's got a nice fluffy toy, and I've contributed to the GDP, the gross domestic product. I have bought something, I've done my duty as a consumer. And that idea that we should be spending, that we should be contributing to the GDP, that the GDP must go up and up and up, that the economy must expand, has really been the center of my own slightly small space of economic conservation. Is that necessarily the case? Why is it such a taboo? Why actually can the smallest child understand that we live on a finite planet and that to expand forever is a complete nonsense? And yet we live in a system, inside a system, in which the GDP must go on rising forever. Anybody who thinks that the economy can go on expanding exponentially forever must be a madman or an economist, said Kenneth Boulding. And of course, we're surrounded by economists. They have a lot of influence in the world. They talk a lot to politicians. The politicians take that on. The idea of the growth in the GDP is almost like, it's become almost like a kind of pissing contest. My GDP is bigger than your GDP. We're growing faster in the West than we are in the other countries. What's going to happen if the UK slips down the league table in the growth rate of the GDP? And yet it's just this silly, silly number that counts a lot of things that create havoc in the world, that fails to account for what makes the most impression on us, what is most important to us in our lives. And a part of what I've done in that small corner of economic conservation is to challenge that view, to challenge it with government. In fact, I was asked as Economics Commissioner in 2004 to set in place a program exploring the difference between economic output, and prosperity. The idea of doing well and being well. The idea of having a better quality of life. The idea of separating out that idea of doing well from the economy itself. The idea of prosperity without growth. A good quality of life without trashing the planet. The ability to do well and live well, and to ask serious questions about what that might mean. And it was a very interesting experience. I mean, I was working as an economist for the UK government and expected to report to the UK government, and I did report to the UK government in 2009 in that report called Prosperity Without Growth. And I have to tell you, that particular government at that particular time was not too happy with the report that they received. In fact, the very idea of questioning growth was deemed to be an impossibility, a kind of taboo. And I remember a meeting at which a Treasury official got up and said, now I see what sustainability means. It means going back to live in caves, doesn't it? You're really trying to stop civilization with your questioning of growth. Growth is the most important thing that keeps the economy stable. Why on earth do you think you have anything to say about the GDP? And should you not actually go away and do something nice and safe in some corner about internalizing an externality somewhere like all economists are supposed to do? Actually, this questioning may turn out to be the most important thing that we have to do. And one of my lessons from that, and it was a real lesson of hope, was that every turn I was faced with kind of impossibility theorems. It's impossible for people to have jobs if you don't have growth. It's impossible for the economy to remain stable if you don't have growth. It's impossible for governments to do anything about it. And worst of all, perhaps, this idea that it's actually human nature to want to grow and grow and grow and expand and expand and expand. And ask any parent, of course, you want your kids to grow up. But then at a certain point, you'd rather hope they stop growing. Particularly when it gets to about there, and you're kind of thinking, how do I hand over to a generation who is now about there? And certainly what I want for them is a kind of a world where these impossibility theorems are overcome, where we have the courage, in fact, to say that these things are not impossible. And one of my lessons from that time was at every turn that these impossibility theorems dissolve, that in fact the equation of jobs with growth is a false equation. Of course you can have jobs without expanding the world. There's enough demand for people's time and for the good that we do in the world that you don't have to continually expand your economy to have that sense of fulfilling employment. Of course we can make a stable economy without growth. In fact, our chasing growth created the financial instability of the crisis. And best of all, perhaps, this question of human nature. I'm not suggesting that we are angels. I'm not denying that we have material aspirations and that we are sometimes selfish. That was reflected, of course, partly in my kids' desire for this material stuff. But underlying that desire for material stuff actually is an aspiration to be social, to be bonded to other people, to be connected to the real world, to be able to go out into the wild, as we did the next day, and simply be there, to tread lightly on the planet, to take nothing away from us and leave only footsteps behind, to have more fun with less stuff. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. Next up, we have Sebastian Pol, who is co-founder and master herbsmith. What a great title, of Plucker Herbs. And Sebastian will be talking about how the incredible power of plants can save the world.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Great. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. I am a gardener and a herbalist and the co-founder of Plucker Herbs in that order. And I want to talk to you today about how the incredible power of plants can really help create a healthier planet and healthier people. And I also want to talk about how business can be a force for good and how we can all be responsible for creating that change. So I've got a completely opposite presentation to everyone else, where I've got loads of slides. It's one of those moments where there's so much to do and so little time. It's a metaphor for what's going on in the world. And it's almost too obvious to say that plants are the source of all of our life, providing the air we breathe, purifying the water that we drink, nourishing the soil that gives us our food. Of course, it provides our shelter and clothes as well. But what isn't perhaps so obvious is that plants provide the majority of our medicines. Throughout history, plants have given us the majority of all of our healing herbs, if you like. And by far and away, the largest majority of people in the world depend on plants for their health. And it's a pretty incredible thing that out of the 390,000 plants that we know are around in the world, there are nearly 18,000 of them are medicinal. And It's this huge resource that we have in nature at our fingertips that I want us to explore, and how we can protect them into the future. So this is from the Kew's State of the World of Plants report from last year, showing that 1 in 5 plants is threatened. You know, this 20% of our source of all of our air, water, food, medicines are threatened. And so what can we do about protecting them into the future? With so many of the plants coming out of the wild are used in the natural industry. So a quarter of all the plants used in the natural ingredients industry come from the wild. And when I found this out, I just couldn't believe that that wasn't common knowledge in a way. You know, fruit jams, mushrooms, herbal teas, of course, so many medicines coming out of the wild. How can nature sustain this pressure? You know, it's millions and millions of kilos of herbs being harvested by marginalized communities from marginalized parts of the world that are facing increasing pressure. And so 15 years or so ago, when I set Plucker, we started to explore how can wild collection contribute to conservation instead of it contributing towards degradation, really. And I've had a wonderfully privileged time this last decade traveling to many corners of the world to explore how sustainable wild harvesting can take place. And here I am in the Western Ghats with one of the NGOs we work with in India, the Applied Environmental Research Foundation. You know, behind us is an area of decimated woodland, and in front of us was this relatively pristine forest supporting communities. And, you know, as business is such a big part of the problem, how can business be a big part of the solution? And can we really drive conservation through business? And so we have this mission at Plucker that through the incredible power of plants, we'll inspire people to lead a more conscious life. And that's really being more conscious of the beauty of nature, the power of how interconnected nature is, and really to be more conscious of the fact that, you know, we and nature are one. This whole idea that we're separate, as Jane was talking about earlier, is ironic, basically, isn't it? When we are totally dependent on nature for our own survival. And so Plucker is a business that is really set up to drive conservation at its heart. We sell things, we cause consumption, but at the heart of what we're trying to do, we harvest over 150 species of herbs in 30 different countries. And they go into our 40 teas and supplements, and we serve about 1.5 million cups of tea a day. And what we're trying to do is have a business model that, leads to a socially fairer world. So all of our teas are fair trade through Fair for Life, and an environmentally more conscious world. So everything we do is organic. I'm not going to go on a tirade against modern industrial agriculture, but I would quite like to. And an economic model where business recognises its value in the world and what it has to repay. And so we are a member of 1% for the Planet, and 1% for the Planet is where businesses give 1% of their turnover off their top line to environmental NGOs. And so we've been doing that for the last couple of years. And it's this sort of business model, I think, that can help provide us as consumers with solutions, basically. And in the context of what we're talking about in conservation today, one of the best certification schemes that I know of is called Fair Wild. And Fair Wild is a certification scheme that was supported through WWF and Traffic and IUCN and other great conservation communities to ensure that wild harvested plants are sustainably harvested, and that the people collecting them are paid fairly, and that the communities where the plants come from are remunerated fairly. And we are in the head office, the building where the head office of Fair Wild is situated, which is about 3 floors up. And it's a great privilege for me to come here and be amongst Traffic's community doing so much to protect the trade in endangered species. And I want to tell you 3 stories about these 3 plants and about how they're impacting the health of the planet. So first of all, there's licorice, one of the sweetest plants in our world. It's got a compound in it that's 50 times sweeter than sugar, and with diabetes growing at over 400% in the last 20 years. It's something that's going to be helpful in the future. Licorice, because it's so delicious, has become over-harvested. You know, China's put bans or limitations on export. Turkey is now also restricted there. And we harvest our licorice in a part of Kazakhstan. It's a 1,000-hectare area, and you can get about 1,500 kilos per hectare. And when you harvest sustainably, you do a resource assessment to make sure that you're not taking out more than that area can sustain over a period of time. And licorice has to regenerate over a period of 5 years. And so this 1,000 hectares means that we can take out 300 tons of licorice a year over a 5-year rotation system and not deplete any of the stocks. So in this one project, we can't take out more than 300 tons a year. So as a result, we've had to set up 2 other projects, you know, one in Spain and one in Georgia. And that is how we can grow sustainably. So the second story is elderflower. And you would say, how can elderflower be endangered? But it's really a story about people, and a rather sad story from the Bosnian conflict, where the 2 of the communities there destroyed a lot of the local area. And you'd be surprised to know that elderberries are one of the most powerful antiviral solutions we have in our society. And with the rise of antibiotic resistance, we can see that nature provides this innate protection. And so we've been collecting herbs from this area for the last 7 years or so. And what happened was a lot of the local communities left their surrounding area because of the bombing, and the villages were decimated. 20 years later, the 2 different communities have come together and have started wild collecting in this area. And there are now over 300 certified fair wild collectors collecting 100 different species, but only 7 of these species are fair wild certified. So what we need to do, I love this quote, you know, in the end, we will only conserve what we love, we will only love what we understand, and we will only understand what we are taught. So we have to go out and educate, and that's what is such a great duty that Cambridge and other great institutions are fulfilling. And if we need to educate people to understand the problem, once people understand the problem, they will love it. Because behind all these ideas around our care for the earth is that feeling of love, really. So my final story is about Triphala. Triphala is a combination of 3 fruits, and it is the most popular herbal formula in the world, and is India's leading formula. It's made from 3 different types of fruits, and we collect one of the species, Bibitaki, in the Western Ghats, which is one of the world's conservation hotspots, areas of intense biodiversity. And this tree, the Bibitaki, grows to 20 or 30 meters and is a majestic, beautiful tree. And it's one of the only homes for the great-pied hornbill. And the great-pied hornbill is obviously a keystone species, spreads the fruits, and needs these huge trees to live in. Usual story, painful story, lots of logging, lots of pressure on the local community to survive economically. And you can see here's a picture of a temple. As that temple gets regenerated and rebuilt, the trees on the right, you can see they're now gone. So even in these sacred areas, the pressure on the community to generate funds through chopping the trees down is huge. So what we've done is created some incentives for the local community, where we now collect the fruits through these nets, and that gives the community some money for the fruits. That means they feel that nature is more valuable standing than chopped down, and we can therefore help provide an income for the local community. We can protect the Bibitaki tree, this majestic tree. It can protect the hornbill, and that can help contribute to a more diverse and beautiful natural environment. And so just to finish, really the big question is, how can we all make it our business to be a part of the solution? So whether you are an academic or a student, or you run your own business, or whatever you do, you know, we can all make it our choice. Every time we go shopping, as Tim was saying, there is a choice and a chance for us to make the best decisions. And so I just finished with a little idea that we can go out with a splash of love, Our feeling that we're trying to connect with nature is one of care and consideration, and that choice is up to us. So thank you very much, everyone.
Now, next up, we thought we'd do something a little bit different. We've, throughout the day, got a series of pop-up speakers, and what we've done, we've randomly put envelopes under each of your chairs, and one of you's going to speak now. No, you're not. If I'd organised today, I'd have made you do that. We do have a group of speakers who we've interspersed in the audience who are going to pop up, so to speak, and give a 5-minute crunch of a talk. And our first speaker today is not only a Tropical Biology Association alumnus, sorry, he is also doing his MPhil here at the moment, and he's looking into conservation leadership, talking about a leap from the brink, how the slippery frog overcame extinction. That's a tongue twister, thank you. We have David Kwarteng. Where are you?
So we all know how the chimps call or cry. And this is how the leapfrog also whistles. Now, the first time that I heard this whistling, I was terrified. Because this was in the midnight, in the middle of a rainforest. And you all know how dark and humid it could be. And then hear this real incredible whistling. And what amazing it was to have such a feeling, but it was also of terror, because in the forest where I was, there was a big signage which said, "Beware of dwarfs." So the first thing, whoa, is that a dwarf calling? But it wasn't a dwarf, it was a frog. Now, this frog was thought to be extinct for 40 years. So nobody expected it to be there in that community forest. But there it was. And it was amazing to see it. We were very excited to have finally found the frog. Unfortunately, the joy didn't last for long. Why? Because we learned that this same frog was considered the chief meat of the local community. Amazing, isn't it? How a frog that has been thought to be extinct just find a small population, and then this small population is also a chief meat. How can you convince these local people who find this frog as their most delicious meat to conserve them? That was such an amazing task. But we work with the communities. In Ghana, one good thing is that people respect the authority of their chiefs and their kings. So we use this to our advantage, working with the local community heads. And one amazing thing is that a lot of people are also very religious. So we used the religious institutions, the churches and the mosque, in a very nice way, a term that we coined conservation evangelism, where we go to churches and mosques to preach conservation. Because people admire and adhere to what they hear from the churches and from the mosque. To cut a long story short, the most incredible thing now is that we've been able to establish the first ever amphibian conservation sanctuary for the frog. This is really amazing. I thought we'd give it a clap. So how do we do this? We all know that conservation don't just happen. People do them. And the people who make conservation happen, they need skills, they need empowerment, they need networks, and they need support. And that's how I'm very grateful for the Tropical Biology Association. Now, all the people who got involved in this project were young people who had passion. But passion doesn't bring anything when you have not got the right knowledge. But TBA founders give us the support, give us the skills, give us the training, and sent us out there to go and save species. And today, if this frog is still whistling, then it was because of the empowerment and the support and the mentorship that we got. I want to conclude and to say that it's good that we have passion, but we need to back the passion with the right set of skills and the right knowledge and the right empowerment and support in order to make the species that we love thrive for the longer term. And so let us all go there and then make this work. Let's see the little species that we can. And I know that now in the forest of Amajope, the origin of life, if the whistling of this frog can still be heard, thanks to TBA. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, David. Well, it's been a great first session already, and just trying to sum this up is almost impossible. We've heard, we'll do it in reverse order, we've heard from David how it really is never too late. Something that was extinct, that wasn't a wolf, could still be saved from the very brink of extinction. We heard Sebastian say that it's our own choice to make a difference, and it is, it really is. And he said there's so much to do in such small amount of time. There's that sense of urgency. But we can do it, it's never too late. We also heard from Tim. I love this sense of everyday conservation. Why don't we make a pledge here now, each and every one of us, to do something every day positive for the world around us? It'll make a huge difference, and it would spread that idea of everyday conservation. And with Jane, the idea that to strive forwards is driven by a personal connection to that world around you. If you don't like frogs, don't save a frog. Save a badger. If you don't like badgers, fine, go save a frog. Do something that's personal to you. I think that all the talks we've had this morning really emphasize that we can all make that one difference. And it can be a little difference that collectively on Earth Day, with Earth Optimism behind us, will make a big difference.